By the time Leon Kennedy arrived in rural Spain, Saddler had already spent years building a cult, uncovering an ancient parasite, and putting a plan into motion that threatened far more than a single village. But who was he before Los Iluminados? Where did his beliefs come from? And how did he become one of the most dangerous figures in the entire Resident Evil timeline? In this video, we're going to explore the complete story of Osmund Saddler, from his origins and rise to power to the events of Resident Evil 4 and his ultimate downfall. So if you've ever wanted the full story behind the man pulling the strings, this is where it begins. Part 1. Las Plagas before Los Iluminados. Long before the rise of modern weapons, Las Plagas existed as an ancient species native to the subterranean caverns of rural Spain. These organisms didn't behave like traditional viruses or bacteria that cause mindless rot. They attached themselves directly to the nervous systems of living hosts. This unique method allowed the parasite to bypass the cognitive functions while keeping motor coordination pristine. The biology of the organism relied on a complete integration with human tissue. Once the parasite secured its position along the spinal column, it began altering the host's behavioral traits. It doesn't destroy cells or liquefy muscle tissue during the assimilation phase. The host remained fully functional, capable of executing complex physical movements without displaying signs of cellular decay. The species maintained a collective consciousness that linked every individual host together. This neural web allowed the organisms to share sensory data across distances without utilizing vocal signals. The group functioned as a single entity, directed by internal frequencies that bypassed individual choices. The mechanism provided a flawless tool for total behavioral modification. The subterranean ecology of the region allowed the parasites to thrive undisturbed for thousands of years. They nested inside deep rock veins away from the changing climate of the surface world. The local geology shielded the cluster, keeping the specimens in a stable environment until human miners breached the cavern walls. It wasn't a random infestation, operating instead as an organized system of biological control. Observations suggested how the organisms managed their growth cycles within the dark caves. They required a living host to transition from larval forms into mature parasites. Without a body to colonize, the spores entered a state of suspended animation inside the stone tissue. This adaptive survival trait ensured the species could outlast generations of human history without losing its infectious utility. Part 2. The first worshippers of the parasite. Centuries ago, early inhabitants stumbled into the deep mining veins of the region. These workers became the first victims of the parasite's design because they lacked protection. They didn't possess the scientific vocabulary to understand parasitic neurology or molecular biology. When the organism attached to their nervous systems, they interpreted the collective consciousness as a divine gift. The sudden loss of free will didn't cause panic among the infected population. They viewed the mental takeover not as biological enslavement, but as a state of peaceful ascension. The internal voice of the parasite replaced their individual doubts with an absolute certainty. This psychological shift transformed an ordinary infection into a sacred experience for the early villagers. The community constructed primitive altars inside the caves to mark the transformation zones. They gathered in the dark tunnels, their voices joining in uniform chants directed by the telepathic link. The parasite's influence reshaped their social order, erasing personal rivalries to establish a compliant collective. They didn't resist the infection, opening their bodies willingly to the larval forms. The early rituals reinforced the authority of the organism over the daily routine of the tribe. The leaders interpreted the parasite's signals as holy mandates that dictated their movements. They believed the fluid inside their veins granted them a spiritual protection against external hazards. The faith grew around a biological reality that they couldn't define through standard science. This primitive devotion established a baseline pattern of worship that persisted for generations. The infected individuals passed the parasites to their offspring, turning the condition into a hereditary tradition. The community detached from the outside world, isolating their settlement within the fog-shrouded valley. Their faith wasn't an abstract theory, operating as a physical bond managed by the organism. Part 3. The original Los Iluminados. Driven by the collective infection, the hosts organized themselves into a structured entity known as Los Iluminados. The group built a theological dogma around submission to the parasite. They designed ceremonial robes, sacred icons, and ritual altars to codify their devotion. They preached that true enlightenment required a person to surrender their mind to the collective will of the Plaga. The leaders of the cult wore elaborate vestments to distinguish themselves during the weekly gatherings. They managed the distribution of the larval organisms from central chambers hidden beneath the mountain chapels. The hierarchy was absolute, mirroring the top-down control mechanism of the parasite itself. Anyone who questioned the sacred scripts was quietly integrated into the next infection cycle. The religious symbols depicted the organism as a multi-legged deity that brought light to the dark valley. The iconography was carved into the stone lintels of their homes to signal total compliance. They didn't view the parasite as a pathogen, treating the physical mutation as a mark of spiritual election. The theology successfully masked a biological colonization layout behind a layer of holy reverence. The daily life of the cult members was completely governed by the frequencies of the collective mind. They abandoned their traditional agricultural traditions to focus entirely on the expansion of the faith. The settlement became a closed loop where no independent thoughts could survive the chemical saturation of the host's brainstem. The organization functioned as an early prototype for mass biological control. The original movement expanded its reach across the regional borders, drawing the attention of neighboring provinces. The fanatical devotion of the members made them aggressive neighbors who sought to convert external populations through force. They utilized infected samples to compromise the defense lines of nearby settlements. The cult had transformed a localized infestation into a regional crusade that threatened the feudal order. Part 4. The Salazar family's suppression of the cult. The medieval expansion of the cult was permanently halted by the first Castellan of the Salazar dynasty. The noble ruler recognized that the aggressive behavior and hive mind devotion of Los Iluminados represented an existential threat. The feudal order required independent subjects who answered to the crown, not an infected populace controlled by an underground parasite. He mobilized his knights to launch a systematic war. The conflict was a brutal campaign that targeted the cult's sacred strongholds across the valley. The noble forces dismantled the mountain chapels and cleared the ritual altars from the rock tunnels. They didn't offer amnesty to the infected hosts, viewing the condition as a permanent corruption of civil loyalty. The survivors were stripped of their ancestral lands and pushed into the deep excavation pits. To ensure the infection could never return to the surface, the Castellans sealed the deep mines with heavy iron gates. He commissioned builders to construct a massive stone castle directly over the primary cavern systems. This fortress functioned as a physical shield designed to bury the religion and its biological foundations forever. The family logs recorded the operation as a holy victory for the province. The suppression policy included a mandatory ban on the cult's name and iconography within the territory. The legal teams drafted strict decrees that punished any mention of the Plaga with immediate execution. The family archives were locked inside the castle vaults to prevent future generations from uncovering the maps of the sealed mines. The ancestors believed their architecture had permanently neutralized the hazard. The noble dynasty managed the territory with an iron discipline for several centuries, keeping the seals intact. They built a reputation as protectors of the region, their wealth tied directly to the castle's defensive integrity. The memory of the parasites faded into local folklore, dismissed as a primitive myth by the educated public. The family didn't realize that their castle was sitting on a dormant engine of rot. Part 5. The cult that refused to die. Despite losing their fortresses, the remnants of Los Iluminados refused to vanish from the historical record. The religion survived across the centuries as a forbidden memory passed down through isolated generations. Families kept the old traditions alive inside quiet households, away from the castle guards. They didn't abandon their devotion to the collective mind, waiting for a catalyst to break the ancestral seal. The cult's iconography remained etched into the stone walls of hidden caverns and ancestral dungeons. Small groups gathered in secret during the midnight hours to recite the forbidden scripts. They lacked the active larval organisms, but they maintained the psychological framework of absolute submission. The faith was a dormant sequence that required a modern hand to initialize the extraction lines. The isolated geography of the valley assisted in preserving the forbidden network from complete liquidation. The high mountains and dense fog kept external regulators away from the small farming communities. The local residents maintained a collective silence, protecting their neighbors from the inquiries of the castle administration. The culture was thoroughly saturated with the memory of the parasite long before Saddler arrived. The ancient texts predicted that a high prophet eventually arrived to unseal the vaults and restore the Plaga. This prophecy kept the remnants organized, providing a long-term goal that outlasted individual lifespans. They monitored the movements of the Salazar heirs, searching for a weakness in the family's administrative shield. The devotion had transformed from an active infection into a generational waiting game. The structural survival of the cult proved that ideological indoctrination can outlast physical military suppression. The stone castle above the mines was an impressive barrier, but it couldn't alter the beliefs of the people below. The underground lines remained intact, a silent network waiting for a leader who possessed the scientific knowledge to transform their faith into a global weapon. Section 2. Saddler's Rise as Prophet. Part 6. Osmund Saddler. Before Resident Evil 4, Lord Osmund Saddler entered the rural Spanish region during the late 20th century as an intelligence strategist. He possessed a profound background in genetics and biology, tracking assets for independent syndicates. He didn't arrive with a genuine reverence for the ancient myths of Los Iluminados. He viewed the legend as an entry point to secure a valuable biological monopoly. His early research files showed that he recognized the unique utility of the buried parasite. Unlike traditional viruses that cause cellular rot, this organism offered a mechanism for absolute behavioral control. He realized that if he could weaponize the species, he could build a global empire without relying on expensive cybernetic systems. The project required him to exploit the local history to gain access to the mines. He spent months analyzing the psychological profile of the regional population before launching his campaign. He discovered a community that was uneducated, isolated, and deeply influenced by old religious fears. He understood that cold clinical logic wouldn't convince these people to accept an infection. He chose to wrap his biological project inside the armor of the resurrected cult. Saddler used his private capital to fund his initial operations in the valley, establishing secure lines of communication with black market suppliers. He imported laboratory equipment under false manifestos to avoid attracting the notice of international intelligence agencies. He didn't reveal his scientific credentials to the locals, adopting the language of a spiritual guide who had come to fulfill the old prophecies. His entry into the territory was a calculated invasion that used manipulation instead of military force. He positioned himself as the answer to the community's economic stagnation and spiritual isolation. The strategy allowed him to bypass the natural defenses of the valley, establishing a secure base before the surface authorities realized a threat was developing. The master planner had initialized a countdown for the region. Part 7. Saddler as Lord and Prophet. To execute his grand design, Saddler retrofitted the ancient religion and appointed himself as the absolute lord. He assumed the title of High Prophet, donning ceremonial robes and carrying an ornate staff that contained hidden electronic components. This public persona was engineered to project a divine authority that demanded unquestioning obedience from his followers. He wasn't a simple administrator operating as a spiritual monarch. He carefully managed his public appearances to reinforce the illusion of his supernatural connection to the parasite. When he spoke to the assembled crowds, his voice was amplified by the telepathic frequencies of the dominant strain. He ensured that his directives were perceived as as holy revelations necessary for the ascension of the human race. The strategy made it impossible for his subjects to separate faith from biology. The leader centralized all data transmission through his personal staff, turning his words into the sole link to the hive mind. He didn't allow subordinate researchers to issue commands to the general populace, maintaining a strict monopoly over the telepathic network. This total centralization ensured that his authority remained absolute even if a local sector experienced a containment breach. His position was insulated from internal mutiny. He conducted elaborate ordination rituals inside the mountain chapels to bind the local leaders to his script. He presented the infection as a holy baptism, forcing the candidates to kneel before his staff while the larval organism was inserted. The ceremony transformed his inner circle into loyal enforcers who viewed his authority as a permanent law. The prophet had successfully built a command chain that bypassed civil legislation. His rule turned the valley into a closed-circuit playground where his will was the primary physical law. He monitored the metrics of the community from his central console, his eyes tracking the compliance rates of the infected villagers. He didn't see human beings, evaluating his followers strictly as functional components of his biological machine. The High Prophet was ready to expand his network beyond the regional borders. Part 8. Faith as a Weapon. Saddler masterfully weaponized religious language and apocalyptic prophecies to exploit the fears of the uneducated population. He didn't introduce the parasite as a bioweapon or a corporate asset to the villagers. He presented the organism as a holy, cleansing gift that had saved humanity from the corruption of the outside world. This deception allowed him to bypass the natural survival instincts of his targets. The extreme agony of the parasitic implantation was framed as a sacred test of spiritual devotion. He taught his followers that the physical pain was merely the burning away of their old sins during the transformation phase. The candidates willingly lined up outside the clinics, eager to prove their faith by surrendering their nervous systems to the needle. The psychological manipulation turned an infection into a voluntary act of worship. He utilized the cult's ancient icons to validate his modern biological procedures inside the clean rooms. The vats and syringes were decorated with religious symbols to make the scientific intervention feel like a holy ritual. The workers handled the volatile fluids with a reverence that prevented them from questioning the lethality of the trials. The faith had successfully desensitized the staff to the horror of their tasks. The sermons delivered from the stone pulpits focused heavily on the necessity of absolute submission to the dominant voice. He designed a vocabulary that associated independent thoughts with spiritual damnation and biological rejection. The listeners accepted the mental lockout because the prophet promised a peaceful ascension, free from suffering. The system turned the host's conscience into an active ally for the parasite's development. This weaponization of belief allowed Saddler to build an army that required no financial maintenance or complex programming. The hosts didn't require automated control grids, driven instead by an internal devotion that outpaced traditional military discipline. They threw themselves into the firing line because their faith assured them that their sacrifice was part of a divine plan. The prophet had turned the human soul into a weapon. Part 9. The cult leader and the bioweapon. What fundamentally separated Osmund Saddler from traditional umbrella virologists like William Birkin was his reliance on ideological indoctrination. While the company's scientists struggled to build expensive cybernetic soldiers like the Tyrant or Nemesis, Saddler bypassed automated control grids entirely. He understood that a host who obeys out of faith is more reliable than a creature managed by a digital chip. The research tracks executed inside Nest or the Arclay lab relied on cold clinical logic that often resulted in mindless decay. The viruses destroyed the higher cognitive filters of the subjects, leaving behind erratic consumers that couldn't operate tools or follow tactical commands. Saddler's parasite preserved the host's tactile memory and vocational skills, keeping their physical utility pristine under his top-down network. The business models of the Western pharmaceutical giants required massive financial investments to maintain physical containment barriers. A single leak in Raccoon City liquidated their entire corporate structure within a matter of days, because the public revolted. Saddler's facility was protected by the population itself, the infected locals acting as a security shield that buried the science away from federal eyes. He didn't look at his biological assets through the narrow lens of a patent portfolio or a balance sheet. He viewed the Plaga as a tool for total societal reorganization, where the borders between religion and warfare vanished completely. This comprehensive approach allowed him to achieve a level of stability that Umbrella's black budget divisions never matched during their decades of operations. The cult was a functional empire. The synthesis of faith and virology produced a product that was uniquely adapted for international infiltration. He could project his power across borders without deploying a single dropship or triggering a regional border alarm. The infected hosts moved through the civilian world as ordinary individuals, their parasites hidden beneath their clothes until the prophet issued the telepathic command. The cult leader had engineered the perfect delivery system. Part 10. The rediscovery of the parasites. Saddler's global ambitions were officially unlocked when his research team successfully mapped out the historical excavation grids beneath the Salazar estate. Centuries of isolation had reduced the original adult Las Plagas organisms to calcified dust inside the deep rock veins. The team's initial scans suggested that the biological material was dead, useless for modern synthesis tracks. The advanced molecular analysis executed inside the mobile lab trailers revealed a different reality. While the mature specimens had fossilized, the parasite's microscopic spores had survived in a state of suspended animation deep within the stone tissue. The prehistoric code remained intact, waiting for a chemical catalyst to initialize the replication sequence. This discovery turned the ruins into an active biological source. The technicians extracted the calcified rock blocks, moving them to reinforced containment cells to begin the hydration trials. They used specialized organic solvents to wake the dormant spores from their long sleep beneath the castle foundations. The extraction process required absolute precision to prevent the airborne elements from escaping into the upper residential layers before the parameters stabilized. The data drives logged the initial vital indicators of the larval forms as the cells began to replicate inside the nutrient fluid. Saddler monitored the charts from his central console, his notes confirming that the prehistoric pathogen possessed an exceptional genetic stability. The organism didn't suffer the cellular shock that often ruined the progenitor variants during structural modifications. The asset was ready for mass production. The rediscovery permanently shattered the ancient seal that the first Castellan had constructed to protect the province. The company had located the engine of their new world order buried beneath a layer of medieval masonry. The excavation teams expanded their shafts, their machinery cutting into the deep veins to harvest the raw material. The return of the Plaga had initialized the first phase of the conspiracy. Part 11, Ramón Salazar opens the way. To bypass the complex legal and physical barriers protecting the sealed mines, Saddler targeted Ramón Salazar, the deformed Castellan of the family dynasty. The young noble lived as an isolated figure inside the massive ancestral fortress, his mind warped by a physical condition and the crushing loneliness of his abandoned household. The prophet spent months analyzing his deep-seated psychological insecurities, slowly inserting himself into the boy's daily routine under the guise of a spiritual guide who came to restore his true legacy. He fed the Castellan's growing narcissism, convincing the boy that his physical limitations were a mark of genetic election that separated him from the uneducated peasants below the castle walls. Saddler masterfully exploited the young noble's intense family guilt over his ancestors' historic persecution of the ancient religion. He presented the medieval holy wars as a horrific crime against the divine will, convincing Salazar that his primary administrative duty was to atone for the sins of the first Castellan. The brainwashing process was a slow, systematic dismantling of the boy's secular loyalties, replacing his feudal obligations with a fanatical devotion to Los Iluminados. Consumed by a desperate desire for spiritual absolution and personal power, the young heir surrendered his judgment to the prophet's suggestions without consulting his remaining legal advisors. Once the psychological takeover was finalized, Salazar unsealed the family vaults and handed the keys of the estate directly to the cult's security details. He signed administrative decrees that granted the organization total territorial immunity, effectively removing the entire valley from the jurisdiction of the national government. The young Castellan personally financed the initial excavation grids, draining his ancestral treasury to purchase advanced black market drilling machinery from international suppliers. He opened the iron gates that had remained locked for centuries, allowing the research teams to descend into the deep rock veins where the dormant hazard rested. The noble family's historic home was instantly transformed into a logistical staging ground for the biological operations. Salazar allowed the technicians to install mobile laboratory trailers inside the ancestral courtyards. His private guards integrated into the cult's security matrix to monitor the perimeter lines. He watched the initial extraction runs from his balconies with a manic satisfaction, believing his actions were fulfilling a holy covenant that had elevated his name above his ancestors. He didn't realize he had become a simple pawn in a global bioterror plot. His aristocratic authority used as a temporary shield to hide the science from external investigators. The deletion of the family's ancient seal removed the final physical barrier that had isolated the parasites from the modern world for generations. Salazar's treason allowed Saddler to build an industrial network directly beneath the foundations of civil society, without triggering a national security alert. The young noble remained inside his palace, his mind completely captured by the telepathic frequencies of the dominant strain he'd soon receive as a reward for his compliance. He had traded his family's historic honor for a parasite, opening a door that no conventional military force could close. Part 12. The mines beneath the region. With the ancestral seals permanently broken by the Castellan's decree, Saddler forced hundreds of local village men down into the dark, suffocating mines beneath the castle to initialize the excavation project. The workers spent their daily shifts chipping away at the ancient rock walls with crude pickaxes and heavy industrial drills, their tasks logging the removal of the fossilized strata that held the calcified remains of the parasite. The air inside the deep tunnels was thick with prehistoric dust, a murky atmosphere that lacked proper ventilation grids due to the rapid acceleration of the corporate schedule. The miners labored without protective hazard suits, completely unaware that the stone tissue was releasing a lethal biological asset into their lungs. As the excavation teams breached the primary cavern layers, they inhaled the highly concentrated, airborne prehistoric spores that had remained in a state of suspended animation for centuries. The microscopic organisms incubated rapidly inside the warm, moist environment of the human respiratory systems, their cellular chains waking from their long sleep to initialize the initial phase of the infection loop. Within a matter of weeks, the spores grew into active larval states, their microscopic filaments migrating through the host's bloodstream to locate the central nervous system. The miners experienced severe fevers and internal bleeding at their workstations, but the cult guards refused to allow them to return to the surface. The biology of the ancient organism completed its assimilation phase by attaching itself directly to the spinal columns of the human hosts. The parasite extended its organic tendrils around the nerve bundles, establishing a permanent top-down connection that bypassed the host's higher cognitive filters without destroying their motor coordination. The workers stopped displaying the symptoms of physical illness, their eyes turning glassy as their individual free will was liquidated by the parasitic neurology. They returned to their tasks with a mechanical efficiency, their pickaxes striking the stone in a uniform rhythm that echoed through the dark shafts. The land itself had been transformed into a massive engine of infection that consumed the local population to sustain the research. The deep mines were outfitted with iron security doors and automated elevators to move the harvested material directly to the upper laboratory sectors. Saddler monitored the extraction metrics from his terminal console, recording how the prehistoric code adapted to the modern human matrix. The subterranean space was no longer an archaeological site, operating instead as a functional breeding ground that generated thousands of active biological containers for the cult's expanding army. The contamination spread smoothly through the mining shifts, turning the entire local labor pool into a compliant collective before any external agency noticed the variants. The families in the village received no information regarding the missing men, their inquiries blocked by the administrative walls that Salazar had constructed around the perimeter. The dark water channels beneath the rock carried the chemical runoff from the drilling sites, poisoning the local ecosystem with trace elements of the active pathogen. The ancient valley had become a closed trap, and the source of its destruction was rising from the deep pits. Part 13, From Dormant Organism to Cult Weapon. Once the raw parasites were successfully extracted from the initial human hosts, Saddler moved the project into a high-tech black market laboratory network hidden across the isolated territory. He utilized advanced genetic engineering equipment, molecular synthesizers, and automated incubation vats imported from international suppliers to alter the Plaga's baseline DNA structure. He didn't treat the organism as an archaeological curiosity, focusing entirely on a practical program to maximize its utility as an industrialized biological weapon system. His scientific intervention aimed to accelerate the natural life cycle of the species, reducing the incubation phase from several months to a matter of hours inside the host. The research teams calibrated the genetic sequences to increase the parasite's resistance to traditional medical countermeasures and modern surgical extraction techniques. They engineered the organic tendrils to fuse seamlessly with human nerve tissue, ensuring that any attempt to physically remove the mature organism without specialized radiation gear caused immediate systemic failure and death for the carrier. This mechanical modification turned the infection into an absolute lock that bound the host permanently to the network. The files stored inside the lab mainframes documented these changes with a flat lookup that evaluated the biological transitions purely as data points. This scientific modernization transformed Las Plagas from a forgotten, dormant anomaly into a highly organized, mass-reproducing bioweapon. Saddler mapped out the neural frequencies of the species, using electronic signals to track how the collective consciousness responded to external stimuli inside the testing chambers. He designed specialized nutrient fluids to sustain the larval forms inside portable glass containers, allowing his enforcers to transport the asset across long distances without losing its infectious utility. The product had shed its primitive limitations, turning into an elegant tool designed for top-down behavioral manipulation. The clean rooms inside the laboratory sectors contrasted sharply with the Gothic masonry of the castle above, featuring automated decontamination zones and blast-shielded isolation cells. The technicians adjusted the chemical ratios of the incubation vats while wearing heavy hazard gear that protected them from accidental exposure to the fluid. They logged the mutation rates of the modified strains, ensuring the stability parameters met the strict requirements of the global infiltration plan. The firm had successfully converted an ancient religious myth into a marketable asset that could challenge the security lines of Western governments. The completion of the weaponization phase provided Saddler with a biological engine that outpaced the traditional virus lines developed by the Western pharmaceutical giants. He had engineered a pathogen that preserved the host's intelligence while stripping away their ability to resist an external command. The modified parasites were packed into secure transit cases, ready to be distributed to the local enforcers who managed the surface sectors of the valley. The ancient species had been given a modern edge, and the countdown for the surrounding population had reached a terminal point on the ledger. Part 14, Dominant and Subordinate Plaga. The structural foundation of Saddler's entire empire depended on a strict genetic hierarchy split between two distinct variations of the engineered organism. The subordinate Plaga was mass-produced inside the incubation vats and injected into the general populace of the valley to secure their total compliance. This standard variant was designed to completely strip away the host's individual agency, locking their central nervous systems into a state of total, unquestioning receptivity to external telepathic commands. The lower hosts retained their basic human functions and vocational skills, but their consciousness was entirely muted, turning them into simple biological extensions of the Master Controller's will. Concurrently, Saddler, Salazar, and Chief Méndez injected themselves with the ultra-rare dominant Plaga strain to establish their positions at the top of the hierarchy. This elite variant allowed the host to retain their full human intelligence, memories, personality traits, and structural language capacities after the integration phase was finalized. Instead of surrendering their minds to the collective, these high-level subjects assumed total control over the hive mind, their brains acting as central nodes that could direct the movements of the lower hosts. The elite strain granted its carrier an absolute authority that combined biological dominance with human strategic calculation. The biological mechanics of this top-down control chain relied on high-frequency telepathic acoustic waves emitted directly from the brains of the dominant hosts. Saddler carried an ornate staff that functioned as an electronic amplifier, allowing him to send sweeping pulses across the entire geographic layout of the province. When a dominant carrier issued a mental command, the subordinate parasites inside the Ganados registered the frequency instantly, forcing their hosts to execute the directive without any personal hesitation. This top-down hierarchy created a seamless coordination that bypassed the need for traditional military communication channels or radio sets. The elite strain also granted its hosts the unique ability to undergo physical mutations when facing a severe ballistic threat during a live engagement. The parasite could hyper-accelerate the replication of its own tissue, breaking through the host's skin layers to form armored plates, long tentacles, or specialized appendages designed for combat. This biological defense mechanism ensured that the leaders of the cult were nearly invulnerable to conventional firearms, their altered frames absorbing kinetic trauma with an immense trauma resistance. The dominant variant was a masterpiece of biological engineering that turned the user into a godlike enforcer. This genetic division of labor allowed Saddler to maintain absolute discipline across his entire organization without relying on expensive automated control grids or disciplinary systems. The lower hosts were physically incapable of staging an internal rebellion, their nervous systems locked into a closed loop that ignored any emotional interference or memories of their past lives. The hierarchy was a mechanical law written directly into the DNA of the infected populace, turning the community into an obedient army that was ready to throw itself into a firing line out of pure spiritual and biological devotion. Section 4. The Village under Saddler. Part 15. The Village before Leon arrives. Before the arrival of federal agent Leon S. Kennedy, the isolated, fog-shrouded rural valley had already been completely transformed into a living monument to Saddler's New World Order. The traditional social fabric, local schools, and regular agricultural commerce of the community were systematically dismantled by the cult's administrative enforcers. Every aspect of daily rural life was replaced by a bleak, fanatical devotion to Los Iluminados, turning an ordinary Spanish village into a closed-circuit playground of absolute parasitic containment. The residents no longer answered to the laws of the national government, their existence governed entirely by the mandates delivered from the central altar. The physical appearance of the settlement reflected the deep stagnation that followed the biological takeover, the houses choked with filth and the remains of those who rejected the infection. The local church stood at the highest point of the rocky ridge, its shadow falling across the empty schoolhouse and the rotting fields. The traditional farming routines were abandoned, the fields left untended, while the population focused their remaining energy on fortifying the parameter lines against external intruders. The village had lost its connection to normal human civilization, transformed into a defensive buffer zone designed to protect the laboratory networks hidden in the hills. The social structures that once bound the community together were completely hollowed out, the local priest utilizing his pulpit to enforce the biological compliance of his flock. The children were removed from the local registries, their names erased from the municipal logs to ensure no external regulatory agency could track the population metrics of the valley. The daily routine was a cold sequence of manual labor and mandatory gatherings inside the central square. where the residents stood in silence to receive the prophet pulses. The community was an early prototype for a world where individual identity was treated as an extinct variable. Armed sentries patrolled the narrow mountain passes with trained attack dogs, checking the approaches for any sign of unauthorized public scrutiny from the outside world. They installed hidden tripwires, bear traps, and localized explosive devices along the forest tracks to shred any federal investigators who approached the coordinates. The geographic isolation of the region provided a natural shield that kept the operations invisible to the national police forces, allowing Saddler to finalize his preparation blocks without interference. The village was a functional fortress that masked an engine of biological warfare behind a layer of rural folklore. The files recovered from the chief's private office safe confirmed that the entire community had been converted into a live testing ground for the modified parasites. The researchers tracked the compliance rates of the households, using the data to calibrate the telepathic frequencies of the dominant staff. The inhabitants went about their basic chores with a flat look that ignored the horror of their surroundings, their voices uniform and devoid of personal emotion. The valley had completed its historical transition, turning from a quiet farming settlement into a closed trap, where the clock was ticking down toward its first real field trial. Part 16. The Ganados. The infected residents of the valley mutated into Ganados, representing a terrifying evolutionary departure from the traditional zombie lines developed by the Western pharmaceutical firms. The Ganados were not reanimated corpses whose cognitive functions had been destroyed by cellular necrosis and viral rot. They were fully living, breathing human hosts who retained their vocational skills, tactile memory, and structural language capacities after the parasite fused with their nervous systems. This unique preservation of human traits made them significantly more dangerous than the mindless consumers encountered during the Raccoon City apocalypse. The hosts could coordinate advanced tactical ambushes, communicate over long distances via horn signals, and manage the logistics of a defensive engagement with a lethal human precision. They wielded axes, pitchforks, chainsaws, and torches with an absolute physical coordination, their muscle movements guided by the telepathic frequencies of the hive mind network. When an intruder entered their sector, the local Ganados dropped their tools instantly, shouting uniform alerts to alert the neighboring households before closing the escape lines. They didn't feel physical pain or fear, advancing through ballistic fire without losing their tactical cohesion. The psychological horror of these hosts stemmed directly from the fact that they maintained the outward appearance of a functioning, orderly human community during their free hours. They swept their porches, tended to their livestock, and gathered for mass inside the local stone chapel, according to the traditional schedules that had governed the valley for generations. However, their eyes were entirely glassy. Their houses were packed with rotting refuse, and their domestic lives were completely hollowed out by the parasite code. They were living shells whose identities had been extracted by the organism, their voices echoing the uniform mandates of the prophet. The Ganados utilized the local industrial farm equipment to construct barricades and manufacture crude weapons to defend the valley from federal agents. They managed the fuel supplies for their chainsaws, their tasks logging the maintenance of the defensive parameters with a mechanical efficiency that ignored fatigue. The parasite kept their metabolism running at an elevated rate, granting them a superior physical strength and trauma resistance that allowed them to survive wounds that would liquidate an ordinary civilian body. They were an obedient workforce that doubled as a highly disciplined paramilitary wing. The data logs gathered by the secret researchers showed that the Ganados functioned as a balanced collective, where no individual rivalries could disrupt the execution of a command. Their behavioral patterns were perfectly synchronized, their central nervous systems acting as a unified receiver for the top-down pulses emitted from the central tower. The company had successfully engineered a product that combined the resilience of a biological monster with the practical utility of a human soldier. The cattle were ready for deployment, and their first target was moving through the forest. Part 17. Bitores Méndez, the village chief. To maintain strict order over the volatile valley sector, Saddler utilized Bitores Méndez, the towering local priest and community chief, as his primary infected enforcer. Outfitted with a dominant Plaga strain that granted him superhuman physical strength, near impenetrable muscle tissue, and an absolute authority over the hive mind, Méndez combined his traditional ecclesiastical influence with brutal biological dominance. The towering figure stood over 2 meters tall, his physical presence dominating the narrow corridors of his ancestral manor house and the village square. He was the primary valve that controlled the flow of human material from the surface sectors into the deep mining complexes below. The chief priest used his traditional religious standing to convince the uneducated villagers to accept the initial infection trials before the weaponization phase reached industrial maturity. He delivered powerful sermons from the stone altar, framing the insertion of the parasite as a holy baptism necessary for the spiritual salvation of the community. His words built a secure administrative wall around the operations, allowing Saddler technicians to operate with total civic immunity long before the federal agents arrived. Anyone who expressed doubt regarding the new theology was brought directly to his office for immediate reclassification. The elite strain inside his veins transformed his physical framework into a massive combat asset that could handle extreme ballistic trauma without losing operational coordination. His muscle fibers were reinforced by grey parasitic filaments, making his flesh resistant to standard handgun arrays and close-quarters knife attacks. He monitored the movement profiles of the local sentries from his central terminal, his telepathic link allowing him to send real-time coordination signals directly into the nervous systems of the Ganados. He wasn't a simple village elder, operating instead as a highly efficient tactical commander for the cult. His ancestral manor house sat on the southern edge of the village, its dark wooden rooms packed with historical registries and religious texts that documented the family's long history in the valley. The building functioned as a primary security checkpoint, its heavy iron doors restricting access to the mountain paths that led toward the gates of the castle. Méndez spent his nights behind the desk, his artificial eye tracking the data streams from the laboratory trailers to ensure the compliance rates stayed within an acceptable corporate limit. He was a loyal enforcer who left his human conscience outside the parish borders to serve the brand's monopoly. His final run as the village chief ended in absolute biological and structural collapse when Leon cornered him inside an isolated, burning slaughterhouse near the mountain gate. Forcing his dominant Plaga to activate, his torso violently separated from his legs, transforming his frame into an elongated, centipede-like monster that hung from the ceiling beams. He fought with a feral speed, utilizing his massive prehensile claws to smash the structural supports before Leon utilized localized incendiary traps to completely incinerate his tissue. His death permanently broke Saddler's grip over the local valley, forcing the remaining cult personnel to retreat deeper into the castle lines. Part 18. The church as a control center. The local stone village church functioned as Saddler's primary surface command hub, its religious architecture masking a state-of-the-art acoustic transmission network. Bypassing its traditional ecclesiastical functions, the building was retrofitted with specialized mechanical switches, hidden automated consoles, and high-frequency resonance devices. The prophet utilized the structure to centralize his administrative control over the infected populace, turning a place of quiet prayer into a coordination post for genetic warfare. The heavy oak doors were secured by an intricate biometric lock system that required a specialized insignia medal to cycle the gears. The central feature of the command hub was the massive iron bell hanging inside the Gothic vertical tower, its dimensions calibrated to emit low-frequency vibrations that could travel across the entire valley grid. Saddler discovered that the parasite nervous system was highly sensitive to specific acoustic resonance patterns, allowing him to use the bell chime to transmit sweeping telepathic pulses directly into the brains of the Ganados. When the hammer struck the iron, the acoustic waves activated the aggression loops of the hosts, or forced them into states of sudden, eerie docility at the drop of a dial. The bell was a wireless data transmitter that managed the local workforce. The interior of the chapel featured iron holding cells hidden behind the traditional altar cloths, where the cult's security details isolated high-value targets and non-compliant subjects before their transfer to the labs. It was inside these cold stone pens that Ashley Graham was held after her successful extraction by Jack Krauser's unit. The space was monitored by advanced surveillance cameras linked to the island command bunker, ensuring the high-value political hostage remained secure under the unblinking gaze of the enforcers. The building was a clinical processing node wrapped in the skin of a historic monument. The cemetery crypts surrounding the main structure were retrofitted to store volatile chemical waste and failed genetic prototypes generated by the regional excavation teams. The technicians used the ground to hide the evidence of their illegal human trials from any passing civil authorities or aerial mapping sweeps. The handlers adjusted the security patrols around the perimeter daily, using the local folklore regarding mountain spirits to scare away any uninfected residents who approached the boundaries during the midnight shifts. The churchyard was a secure filter that protected the brand intellectual property. Leon penetration of the church sanctuary shattered the operational integrity of the local surface network, exposing the crimes hidden behind the stained glass panels. He bypassed the mechanical traps and cleared the zealots who guarded the central nave, tracking the high-frequency signals to locate the president's daughter inside the upper gallery cell. The rescue operation turned the sacred space into an active ballistic arena. The stone pillars chipped by automatic fire before the survivors could secure an exit line. The command hub had fallen silent, forcing Saddler to rely on his castle assets to maintain containment over the territory. Part 19. The Horror of Obedient People. The psychological horror of Saddler's village stemmed directly from the fact that the Ganados looked and acted like a functioning, orderly human community during their daily routines. They didn't stumble through the mud as mindless, decaying corpses, maintaining instead a terrifying imitation of civil society across the sectors. They swept their stone porches, tended to their thin livestock, and gathered for mass inside the chapel according to the traditional schedules that had governed the valley for generations. This superficial normality masked a total liquidation of human identity that chilled the blood of any external observer. The reality behind the domestic front was a landscape of absolute biological rot, where the houses were choked with rotting refuse and the personal belongings of those who had been sacrificed to the parasite. The residents worked their fields with a flat, mechanical look that ignored the stench of decay rising from the drainage ditches. Their actions were entirely detached from human emotion, their minds replaced by a collective frequency that directed their movements with a cold spatial efficiency. They were living puppets whose internal strings were managed from a remote console. Their consciousness completely muted by the organism. Their voices provided a uniform chorus of aggression when an uninfected individual breached the parameter lines, their language stripped of personal variation to repeat the hard-coded commands of the cult. They didn't communicate as individuals, their vocal cords utilized as a simple locator beacon to coordinate the movements of the local cluster. The absence of personal dialogue or individual hesitation among the villagers illustrated the complete extraction of their humanity. They were a community of ghosts who wore the clothes of ordinary farmers, their social order a mechanical illusion designed to protect the labs. The horror was amplified by their absolute compliance to the figures who held the dominant strains, throwing themselves into the line of fire without a single trace of self-preservation. A mother'd raise a butcher knife against a rescue agent with the same flat expression she used to tend her kitchen fire, her natural instincts completely overwritten by the parasite code. The community lacked any internal firewalls against the prophet pulses, turning the entire population into a unified weapon that could be flipped from docility to slaughter at the drop of a hammer. It was a picture of perfect societal subversion managed by science. The files recovered from the local offices showed how cleanly the company could hide its atrocities behind the daily habits of an ordinary settlement. The traditional boundaries between the domestic sphere and the laboratory vanished completely inside the valley, turning every kitchen and barn into a potential containment cell for the pathogen. The Ganados remained at their posts until Leon's progress dismantled the surface network, their orderly collective dissolving into open warfare as the primary enforcers were eliminated. The village had demonstrated the bone-chilling reality of a world where compliance was enforced by an organism along the spine. Section 5. The Castle and the Salazar Family. Part 20. Ram Salazar, the Useful Heir. Ram Salazar served as Saddler's most valuable political and financial pawn during the early stages of the biological operation. By feeding the young Castellan's deep-seated psychological insecurities regarding his stunted growth and absolute isolation, the prophet easily gained control over his ancestral assets. He granted the boy a dominant Plaga variant, a medical intervention that hyper-accelerated his physical regeneration while making him feel like an omnipotent god over the territory. Salazar threw the full weight of his noble inheritance behind the cult, handing Saddler absolute tactical control over his massive, heavily fortified mountain castle and its subterranean industrial assets. The young noble used his historic credentials to protect the organization from external regulatory scrutiny, signing administrative decrees that granted Los Iluminados absolute territorial immunity. He viewed his collaboration with the High Prophet as a sacred mission to restore his family's fading glory within the province. Completely unaware that his authority was being used as a temporary cover shield, he personally financed the installation of the black market laboratory networks hidden inside his ancestral dungeons. His private treasury drained to purchase advanced molecular arrays from international suppliers. He was a useful tool whose vanity had rotted his judgment. His presence inside the castle core allowed the cult to operate with total civic immunity, the national police forces unable to breach the noble perimeters without an official federal warrant. Salazar managed his private guard details with an iron discipline, forcing his men to integrate with the spiritual zealots who poured across the multi-tiered battlements. He spent his hours pacing the opulent galleries, his erratic laughter echoing through the marble halls as he monitored Leon's progress via the surveillance cameras. He believed he was managing a divine trial for the intruder, his mind completely captured by the telepathic frequencies of the dominant strain. The relationship between the cult leader and the young heir was a transaction fueled by manipulation and shared arrogance, where traditional noble honor was liquidated to fund a bioweapon system. Saddler treated the Castellan as a disposable asset that could be discarded once the American infiltration plan reached maturity. He allowed the boy to wear his historical costumes and carry his family crests, keeping him distracted while the extraction teams emptied the deep mining pits beneath his floorboards. The young noble was a hollow monarch who had traded his people's safety to secure a seat at the prophet right hand. His ultimate historical run ended in absolute biological and structural collapse when Leon's relentless progression through the fortress caved in his defensive lines. Driven to pure madness by the destruction of his enforcers, the young Castellan stepped onto a specialized altar inside the central tower and physically fused his frame with a massive, multi-tentacled wall-bound Plaga organism. This grotesque mutation was ultimately obliterated by Leon's heavy weaponry, the explosive blast reducing the final heir of the Salazar dynasty to a pile of grey ash. His fall permanently broke the aristocratic shield that had protected Los Iluminados for centuries, exposing the core of the conspiracy to the world. Part 21. The Castle as a Cult Fortress. The Salazar ancestral castle was rapidly transformed into a sprawling cult stronghold after Ram opened the gates. The historic tapestries and family armor sets were pushed aside to make way for iron torture racks, acid pits, and complex traps designed to shred intruders. The fortress wasn't a residence anymore, operating instead as a multi-tiered military installation that protected the subterranean excavation sites. Saddler's engineers retrofitted the medieval architecture with modern surveillance cameras and automated defense systems. The fortress was garrisoned by thousands of zealots who wore heavy ceremonial robes and iron masks. These high-level cult fanatics defended the castle's internal laboratories with a terrifying mix of tactical crossbow formations and religious hysteria. They didn't retreat when their lines were broken, advancing through heavy gunfire to protect the inner sanctums. Their central nervous systems were completely integrated with the parasite, allowing them to coordinate complex ambush patterns across the stone galleries. The interior design of the castle functioned as an active testing ground for the modified viral strains. Subterranean laboratories were built beneath the grand dining halls, where researchers conducted cross-species gene splicing experiments on local test subjects. The clean rooms featured sterile glass partitions that contrasted sharply with the surrounding stone walls. Technicians logged the daily metrics of the biological mutations, while guards patrolled the perimeter corridors with trained attack beasts. The security grid relied on complex gear mechanisms, automated gates, and water traps to restrict movement across the estate. Intruders were systematically funneled into narrow killing zones, where the zealots maintained defensive advantages. The Castellan's personal guards managed the hydraulic controls from central balconies, ensuring that no unauthorized personnel could reach the lower mining shafts. The castle was a massive filter designed to protect the brand's intellectual property. The atmosphere inside the fortress reflected a complete synthesis of medieval religion and modern biological warfare. Statues of the parasite decorated the grand halls, while electronic mainframes hummed behind hidden doors. The organization used the historical weight of the Salazar name to shield their black-budget operations from international surveillance. The castle stood as a formidable barrier that kept the surface world away from the truth hidden in the rock. Part 22. The Verdugo. The biological engineering inside the castle reached its absolute height with the creation of the Verdugo. These creature bodyguards were engineered by surgically fusing the dominant Plaga parasite with the genetic material of insects and human test subjects. The resulting biological hybrid displayed a level of combat efficiency that outpaced the standard weapon lines developed in Western laboratories. They weren't simple mind-controlled hosts, operating instead as specialized executioners. The physical structure of the Verdugo was encased in a highly flexible, bullet-resistant obsidian carapace that absorbed heavy ballistic impact. The creature brandished a massive, prehensile scythe tail that could slice through reinforced steel plates with minimal effort. Its muscle fibers were dense and hyperoxygenated, granting the monster an extreme physical speed that allowed it to move unseen across ceiling framework. The design was a masterpiece of specialized biological warfare. Salazar utilized these twin bodyguards as his personal enforcers, relying on their insectoid efficiency to eliminate any threat to his inner sanctum. The creatures didn't speak or display human emotions. Their neural pathways locked into a single mandate to protect the Castellan. They stalked targets through the ventilation shafts and drainage tunnels of the castle, striking from the shadows before returning to the dark. Their presence gave the young noble a sense of absolute security. During live combat engagements, the Verdugo demonstrated a tactical awareness that made traditional evasion strategies useless. The monster could bend light around its dark shell, blending into the stone background before delivering a lethal strike. Its biological systems were calibrated to track movement profiles and heat signatures, ensuring that no target could hide within the unlit sublevels. The creature represented the absolute fusion of human genetics, insect physiology, and parasitic control. The creature's primary weakness lay in its sensitivity to extreme thermal shifts, which disrupted its cellular cohesion during combat. When exposed to liquid nitrogen, the obsidian carapace hardened and cracked, slowing its physical movements long enough for heavy weaponry to puncture its internal organs. The destruction of Salazar's enforcer proved that even the cult's most advanced biological designs could be broken by calculated tactical force. The executioner's fall marked a major breach in the castle's defensive network. Part 23. Novistadors and Hidden Experiments. Deep within the castle's flooded cellars and massive hanging nests, Saddler's researchers bred the Novistadors. These insectoid mutants were born from cross-species Plaga hybridization experiments that forced insect DNA into human host tissue. The resulting creatures possessed an extraordinary biological capacity to actively camouflage their bodies, becoming completely invisible against the stone environment. They weren't accidental mutations, representing instead a mass-scale genetic testing program. The novistadors filled the cavernous spaces beneath the castle, constructing massive hive structures from digestive fluids and crushed rock. They hunted by sound and vibration, dropping from the ceiling beams to dismantle intruders with their razor claws. Their active camouflage allowed them to set devastating ambushes inside the flooded corridors, where their presence was betrayed only by the sound of their skittering limbs. They were an effective territorial defense mechanism. The presence of these creatures proved that Los Iluminados wasn't merely worshipping the parasite, but actively weaponizing it for specialized military roles. The researchers logged the growth rates and combat efficiency of the insectoid swarms, searching for a design that could be deployed in urban environments. The castle functioned as a massive genetic laboratory, where traditional ethics were completely discarded to achieve biological breakthroughs. The vats ran continuously beneath the grand halls. The nesting chambers were guarded by alpha specimens that possessed reinforced chitin shells and functional wings. These larger variants could fly across the subterranean caverns, directing the lower swarms through high-frequency acoustic signals. The ecology of the nest was completely controlled by the cult's handlers, who used specialized chemical feeds to manage the population density. The cellars had become a lethal labyrinth that swallowed anyone who fell from the upper walkways. The Novistador program demonstrated the adaptability of the Plaga code when combined with non-human organisms. Saddler used these experiments to validate his theories regarding biological control, proving that the parasite could manage complex hybrid species without losing its command link. The insectoid swarms were a chilling preview of the bioweapons the cult intended to export to the global market. The nests remained active until Leon burned the central caverns. Part 24. Salazar's downfall. Ram Salazar's ultimate historical run ended in absolute structural and biological collapse inside the central tower. Driven to pure madness by Leon's systematic infiltration of his fortress, the young Castellan realized his defensive lines were completely broken. He had lost his private guards, his laboratory assets, and his personal bodyguards to the agent's relentless advance. In a final act of desperate hubris, he chose to surrender his remaining human form to the parasite. Salazar stepped onto a specialized altar and physically fused his body with a massive, multi-tentacled wall-bound Plaga organism alongside his remaining Verdugo. The parasite rapidly absorbed their physical frames, hyper-accelerating its tissue growth to transform the tower's interior into a living biological horror. The Castellan's small frame hung inside the central eye socket of the behemoth. His voice warped into a shrieking roar that echoed through the stone framework. The resulting mutation was a colossal monster that utilized thick tentacles and acidic fluids to crush the upper walkways. The creature was anchored to the castle's masonry, its exposed core protected by heavy muscular shields that opened only during attack cycles. Salazar believed his new form granted him divine invulnerability, mocking the agent from his perch inside the pulsing mass. He'd traded his noble bloodline for a grotesque biological shell. Leon utilized heavy weaponry and precise combat movement to bypass the sweeping tentacle strikes and target the creature's vulnerable central eye. Direct high-explosive impacts shattered the outer protective carapace, exposing Salazar's true body to concentrated fire. The kinetic trauma tore through the fused neural pathways, causing the massive organism to detach from the tower walls and collapse into the abyss below. The young Castellan died in agony as his creation dissolved. The death of Ram Salazar permanently broke the aristocratic shield that had protected Los Iluminados for centuries. The noble line was extinct, its wealth spent, and its ancestral home reduced to a burning ruin filled with broken experiments. The fall of the castle forced Saddler to abandon his mainland positions and retreat to his militarized island stronghold. The aristocratic pawn had fulfilled his purpose, leaving the cult exposed to final destruction. Section 6. Krauser, Ada, Wesker, and the Outside World. Part 25. The Plaga as a Global Prize. As Saddler's operations reached industrial maturity, the unique neural control properties of Las Plagas transformed the isolated Spanish territory into a high-value destination. The parasite represented a coveted global prize that drew the immediate focus of rogue syndicates, private military contractors, and independent arms dealers. They recognized that a controllable, non-decaying pathogen could instantly rewrite the laws of modern biological warfare. The region was no longer an isolated valley, operating as an international focal point. Unlike the T-virus, which created unpredictable mutations and mindless decay, the Plaga preserved the host's intelligence and physical utility. This unique characteristic made it infinitely more lucrative for military applications, as an infected army could still operate complex hardware and follow tactical directives. The global black market was eager to acquire a sample, recognized that whoever controlled the dominant strain could dominate the bioweapon trade. The competition for the sample was intense. The collapse of the Umbrella Corporation in 2003 had created a massive power vacuum in the international arms market. Rival organizations were scrambling to secure new biological technologies to replace the old virus lines. Saddler's modified parasite was seen as the definitive breakthrough for the next era of bioterrorism. The isolated Spanish mountains became a battleground for shadowy figures who operated behind the scenes. Multiple undercover agents and mercenaries infiltrated the region under different employer mandates, creating an unstable web of corporate espionage. They monitored the cult's progress from the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to extract the primary research files and live specimens. Saddler was aware of these external eyes, using his defensive network to trap and eliminate any spies who breached the perimeter. The valley was a lethal chessboard. The Plaga had become the ultimate prize for those who wished to project power across international borders without relying on conventional armaments. The potential to subvert governments from within made the parasite a far greater threat than a standard weapon of mass destruction. The stage was set for a global conflict over the control of the organism, a struggle that had outlasted Saddler's cult. The isolated valley had become the center of a new war. Part 26. Jack Krauser's role in the plan. Former US SOCOM operative Jack Krauser entered the region as a deep-cover mercenary seeking biological power. Following a severe injury during Operation Javier in 2002, Krauser felt abandoned by his government and sought out Albert Wesker to restore his physical capabilities. He agreed to infiltrate Saddler's movement, pretending to pledge absolute fealty to the religious crusade to secure a live sample of the dominant Plaga. To earn Saddler's absolute trust, Krauser utilized his elite military training to slip past federal security grids and successfully kidnap the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, in Massachusetts. The tactical execution of the abduction demonstrated his exceptional skills and provided Los Iluminados with the ultimate piece of international political leverage. Saddler rewarded the mercenary by granting him access to the elite parasite strain, which healed his ruined arm and granted him superhuman strength. Krauser operated as a lethal enforcer within the cult's defensive network, managing the military assets on the island complex. He viewed the parasite not as a holy gift, but as a superior combat tool that validated his belief in pure strength. His loyalty was entirely transactional, as he remained secretly bound to Wesker's agenda while playing the role of Saddler's devoted soldier. He was a dangerous double agent operating in a high-stakes arena. His rivalry with Leon S. Kennedy added a personal volatility to the conflict, as Krauser sought to prove that his biological enhancements were superior to Leon's traditional military training. He ambushed the agent multiple times across the island ruins, utilizing a combination of heavy firearms, stealth tactics, and high-intensity knife combat. He was proud of his new power, boasting that the parasite had made him invincible. Krauser's ultimate failure occurred during a brutal duel atop the island ruins, where he unleashed his dominant Plaga variant to transform his left arm into a giant, flesh-shielded blade. Leon managed to overcome the mercenary's brute force through superior agility and precise tactical strikes, leaving Krauser mortally wounded in the dust. The former SOCOM soldier was eventually finished off by Ada Wong, proving that his pursuit of biological power had ultimately made him a disposable pawn. Part 27. Ada Wong's Secret Mission. Operating under the direct employ of a shadow-dwelling rival organization, corporate spy Ada Wong infiltrated the region on a classified extraction assignment. Armed with advanced grappling tech and tactical combat skills, Ada moved like a ghost through the villages, castle, and island complexes. Her mission required her to navigate the deadly crossfire between Saddler's fanatical cult, Krauser's military operations, and Leon's rescue attempt. Her primary objective was the recovery of the master dominant Plaga specimen, a high-value asset known as the Amber. Ada operated with a cool detachment, using her employer's resources to bypass security grids while keeping her true motivations hidden from everyone. She maintained a careful distance from Wesker, fulfilling her contract while ensuring he didn't receive absolute control over the most dangerous variants. She was a master of misdirection. Her presence in the valley repeatedly altered the course of Leon's mission, as she secretly assisted him from the shadows while pursuing her own goals. She provided critical tactical support, unlocked security gates, and ringed church bells to draw the infected swarms away from his position. Their complex relationship was built on a history of shared survival and unspoken trust, though she never allowed her feelings to compromise her contract. Ada's movement through the cult's strongholds demonstrated her exceptional agility and tactical awareness. She infiltrated high-security clean rooms, evaded specialized biological weapons, and extracted critical data files from under the noses of the cult's enforcers. She viewed Saddler's movement with clinical disdain, recognizing the prophet as a dangerous fanatic whose ambition needed to be contained. She was focused on the objective. Her mission finalized atop the island's industrial complex, where she secured the master amber sample following Saddler's defeat. Instead of delivering the primary dominant Plaga to Wesker, she redirected the shipment, providing her employer with a subordinate variant while keeping the master sample for her own leverage. Ada escaped the burning island via helicopter, leaving Leon with an exit route and confirming her status as the ultimate independent operative. Part 28. Wesker's interest in Las Plagas. From a secure, satellite-linked command bunker, Albert Wesker personally directed the operational chessboard inside Spain, following the bankrupt collapse of Umbrella in 2003. Wesker was fiercely competing to build a brand new global syndicate. He recognized that Saddler's modified parasites represented a quantum leap forward in biological control, intending to harvest the master sample to finance his future eugenics programs. Wesker viewed the Plaga as the ideal foundation for his upcoming projects, specifically the development of the Ouroboros virus. The parasite's ability to integrate with the host's central nervous system without causing immediate brain rot offered a template for controlling complex human populations. He didn't care about Saddler's religious theology, evaluating the organism purely as a valuable commercial asset for his global vision. He managed his field operatives with a cold, demanding authority, pushing Krauser and Ada to secure the dominant strain at any cost. When Krauser's loyalty proved volatile and Leon's intervention threatened the extraction timeline, Wesker authorized direct tactical strikes to clear the coordinates. He monitored the situation through high-resolution satellite feeds, his notes calculating the commercial value of the sample on the black market. Wesker's ambition extended far beyond simple corporate profit, as he intended to use the harvested biological data to force a global evolutionary shift. He believed that the majority of the human population was inferior and needed to be filtered through advanced biological agents. The Plaga sample was a critical stepping stone in his plan to position himself as the ultimate ruler of a redesigned world. His reliance on Ada Wong ultimately compromised his immediate goals in Spain, as the spy outmaneuvered him at the extraction point. Though he failed to secure the master amber sample directly from her, he managed to recover a Plaga specimen from Krauser's dead body. allowing his research teams to develop the Type 2 and Type 3 strains deployed in Africa later. Huesca's interest in Spain had successfully fueled the next generation of global bioterrorism. Section 7. Ashley Graham and the American Plan. Part 29. The kidnapping of Ashley Graham. The strategic capture of Ashley Graham instantly elevated Saddler's localized movement from a regional cult into an international hostage crisis. By holding the daughter of the sitting United States president within an unmapped, heavily fortified foreign territory, Saddler effectively paralyzed the American military's ability to launch a traditional tactical invasion. The government couldn't risk a massive airstrike that might kill the high-value hostage. The abduction was executed with precise military efficiency by Jack Krauser, who leveraged his knowledge of federal security protocols to snatch Ashley from her college campus in Massachusetts. The operation left no immediate physical evidence, throwing federal intelligence agencies into a state of total confusion. They treated the incident as a standard political kidnapping, completely unaware of the biological horror awaiting them in Spain. Saddler used Ashley's captivity as an absolute defensive shield, knowing that the US government would send limited personnel to investigate the coordinates. This calculated play forced the deployment of a single insertion agent, Leon S. Kennedy, playing directly into the prophet's hands. The cult leader intended to convert both the rescue agent and the hostage into infected sleeper assets for his expansion plan. The holding cells built into the village church and castle dungeons were retrofitted specifically to contain the young woman under heavy guard. She was monitored constantly by zealots and automated security systems, her presence serving as a lure to draw Leon deeper into the cult's killing zones. Ashley was terrified, surrounded by mutated zealots who viewed her not as a human being, but as a holy vessel for their prophet's design. The kidnapping was the master key that unlocked Saddler's global ambitions, transforming a localized infestation into a direct threat to the seat of Western power. The cult leader had manipulated the international political landscape with masterful precision, using a single hostage to force the US government into a trap. The crisis was a ticking clock that threatened to subvert the entire federal administration from within. Part 30. Ashley is the perfect delivery system. Osmund Saddler had zero intention of demanding a traditional financial ransom or political concessions for Ashley's safe return. His master plan was beautifully, chillingly simple. He injected Ashley with a specialized, slow-incubating subordinate Plaga larva. Once the parasite achieved full maturity and wrapped its organic tendrils around her central nervous system, Saddler planned to send her back home to Washington, D.C. as an obedient asset. The young woman was designed to function as the ultimate biological Trojan horse, using her position as the president's daughter to access the highest levels of global political power. Saddler intended to use her proximity to quietly infect the president, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the entire federal government from within. The subversion would be completely silent, converting the leadership of the free world into compliant hosts for the hive mind. This top-down infiltration strategy eliminated the need for a conventional military invasion or nuclear threat, allowing Los Iluminados to conquer the global superpower without firing a single shot. Once the federal government was compromised, the US military grid could be voluntarily disarmed and redirected to enforce the cult's theology across the globe. Saddler would become the silent ruler of the world behind a political mask. The slow incubating variant used on Ashley was engineered to minimize initial physical symptoms, ensuring she could pass standard medical screenings upon her return to the United States. The parasite worked silently in her bloodstream, slowly extending its neural links toward her brainstem while she remained conscious. She suffered from occasional fevers and internal pain, completely unaware that her body was being prepared to deliver a global apocalypse. The execution of this delivery system depended entirely on keeping Ashley alive and moving her through the extraction pipeline before the parasite reached full maturity. Saddler monitored her vital indicators from his central console, his notes tracking the incubation metrics with flat satisfaction. Ashley was the most valuable asset in the entire Los Iluminados portfolio. A living delivery system that almost brought the world to its knees. Part 31. Leon infected with Las Plagas. Saddler's defense grid captured Leon Kennedy during his early exploration of the valley. Rather than executing him immediately, the cult leader chose to inject him with a live Plaga egg. This calculated move transformed the rescue agent into a ticking biological clock. As the parasite hatched and migrated toward his brainstem, Leon's physical vision and motor controls began fracturing. The infection turned his rescue mission into a frantic race to preserve his sanity. The parasite's growth inside Leon's body created a direct channel for Saddler to monitor his movements. The Prophet could trigger intense physical pain inside the agent's skull whenever he attempted to breach a critical sector. The infection didn't immediately destroy his cognitive faculties, allowing him to fight while his body slowly absorbed the organism. Leon suffered from sudden hallucinations and vision loss, his physical stamina drained by the parasite. Saddler intended to use Leon as a secondary host if the primary delivery plan encountered resistance. By infecting the government agent, the cult leader ensured that the rescue team would carry the organism back to the United States regardless of the outcome. The parasite's tendrils wrapped around Leon's spinal column, establishing neural links that grew stronger with every passing hour. He wasn't just a threat to the cult, operating as a potential carrier for their expansion. The presence of the parasite forced Leon to rely on temporary chemical suppressants supplied by Lucera. These medications slowed the development of the organism, granting the agent precious time to locate an extraction device. Without these chemical treatments, the parasite's growth would have finalized its neural takeover within a day. Leon had to manage his physical fatigue while navigating through hostile territory filled with mutated hosts. The infection added an element of desperation to Leon's tactical decisions throughout his journey. He knew that every minute spent navigating the castle or the island brought the parasite closer to full maturity. The rescue agent wasn't fighting for Ashley's freedom, battling to prevent his own body from becoming a weapon for Los Iluminados. The countdown was running inside his veins, threatening to erase his identity before he could reach the exit line. Part 32. Control through blood and faith. Saddler's master scheme represented a synthesis of hostage politics, biological warfare, and religious subversion. By combining the global reach of the American executive branch with the telepathic control chain of the dominant Plaga, the Prophet envisioned a total world conquest. He didn't need nuclear weapons or traditional armaments to disarm his enemies, relying on a silent biological takeover to achieve his goals. The strategy aimed to convert the leadership of the free world into compliant hosts. The religious theology of Los Iluminados served as the psychological foundation for this global infiltration plan. Saddler believed that true order could only be achieved by erasing individual free will and replacing it with a collective consciousness. He presented the parasite's neural control as a holy gift that would unite humanity under his spiritual authority. The strategy masked a brutal bioweapon project behind a layer of divine revelation. The hierarchical structure of the Plaga species allowed Saddler to maintain absolute command over his network. As the carrier of the dominant strain, his voice functioned as an absolute law that no subordinate host could disobey. By placing a subordinate organism inside Ashley Graham, he secured a direct line of control into the heart of the American government. The plan was designed to spread the infection through the seat of power without triggering a public alarm. The political leverage gained from Ashley's capture paralyzed the American military's ability to launch a traditional invasion. The federal government couldn't risk a tactical assault that might result in the death of the president's daughter. This forced isolation gave Saddler the time needed to finalize the incubation process and prepare his delivery system. The Prophet managed the crisis with a clinical calculation that kept his enemies off balance. The combination of bloodline infection and religious conversion created a weapon that defied traditional defense grids. Saddler envisioned a future where global leaders would voluntarily disarm their nations and bow to Los Iluminados. The plan came remarkably close to succeeding, because it exploited the trust and access granted to the highest levels of political authority. The Prophet was ready to reshape global society through a single infected host. Part 33. Why Saddler's plan almost works. Saddler's infiltration plot came close to achieving absolute success due to the geographic isolation of the Spanish Valley. The remote region lacked modern communication infrastructure, allowing the cult to operate without attracting the notice of international intelligence agencies. The secrecy surrounding the subterranean mining excavations ensured that the parasite's recovery remained hidden from Western governments for years. The cult built its biological network in complete darkness. The total, unblinking loyalty of the infected locals provided an impenetrable security shield around the operation. The Ganados didn't leak information or betray the cult to outside authorities. Their central nervous systems locked into absolute compliance. Anyone who approached the valley was systematically eliminated or converted into another host before they could alert federal agencies. The local population acted as a living wall that protected Saddler's clean rooms. Outside intelligence agencies were completely blind to the biological nature of the threat facing them. The United States government treated Ashley's disappearance as a standard political kidnapping, sending a single agent to investigate the coordinates. This fundamental misunderstanding of the situation gave Saddler a massive tactical advantage during the initial stages of the crisis. The federal authorities didn't realize they were sending their agent into a biological matrix. The controlled leadership of figures like Salazar and Chief Méndez ensured that the cult maintained absolute domestic authority. Salazar's noble inheritance provided political immunity and financial backing, while Méndez managed the local population with brutal discipline. This local structure allowed Saddler to focus entirely on the scientific refinement of the Plaga species. The organization operated as a smooth machine that eliminated internal friction. The plan only began to fracture when Leon Kennedy's tactical skill and Luis Serra's betrayal disrupted the incubation timeline. Until those variables interfered, Los Iluminados remained steps ahead of the federal rescue effort. The Prophet had constructed a system that exploited every blind spot in modern security networks, proving how easily a biological threat could subvert civil society. The plan was on the verge of completion when the chain began to break. Section 8. Leon's arrival and the cult collapses. Part 34. Leon enters Saddler's world. The historical tipping point for Los Iluminados began the moment Leon Kennedy set foot in the fog-shrouded valley, armed with tactical handgun arrays and advanced knife combat skills. The seasoned survivor entered a region that had severed its ties with civilization. He didn't understand the biological nature of the threat when he arrived, expecting a standard search operation for a missing civilian. His entry into the territory forced the cult to confront an adversary who refused to break. Leon's relentless progression through the valley stripped away Saddler's surface defenses room by room. He adapted quickly to the unique behavioral traits of the Ganados, using precise ballistic fire and close-quarters maneuvers to clear the hostile crowds. His presence disrupted the orderly routines of the infected villagers, forcing them to abandon their domestic tasks to defend the perimeter lines. The rescue agent was a chaotic variable inside a controlled system. As Leon moved deeper into the territory, he uncovered the documented history of the cult's biological experiments. The files left in the manor houses and chapels revealed the scale of Saddler's ambitions and the true nature of the Plaga species. Leon realized that his mission extended far beyond rescuing Ashley Graham, as the parasite represented an existential threat to global security. The discovery hardened his resolve to dismantle the network. The agent's ability to survive multiple coordinated ambushes forced the cult to burn through their biological assets at an unsustainable rate. Saddler had to deploy his high-level enforcers and specialized mutations earlier than planned to contain the breach. Every sector Leon cleared represented a permanent loss for the organization's regional infrastructure. The Prophet's absolute control over the valley was beginning to show its first visible cracks. Leon's entry into Saddler's world marked the beginning of a high-intensity conflict that had spanned the village, the castle, and the island. He moved through the hostile landscape with a singular focus, his tactical training allowing him to overcome impossible odds. The rescue agent was dismantling an entire biological empire through sheer willpower and tactical precision. The cult's fortress was crumbling under the weight of his advance. Part 35. Luis Serra's betrayal of the cult. The greatest internal threat to Saddler's empire was Luis Serra, a brilliant researcher who had formerly worked for Umbrella's European division. Hired by Saddler to scientifically stabilize the excavated parasites, Luis utilized his advanced background in virology to refine the Plaga species. However, as he witnessed the horrific human cost and global terror ambitions of Los Iluminados, his conscience forced him to turn against his employer. He became a dangerous defector within the cult's inner circle. Luis's deep understanding of parasitic biology allowed him to identify the critical vulnerabilities in Saddler's network. He recognized that the dominant strain was the central node that held the hive mind together, and he set out to undermine that control chain. Working in secret, he stole a master amber sample of the dominant Plaga, along with vital research data regarding specialized chemical suppressants. His actions threatened to destroy the scientific foundation of Saddler's entire operation. The defector developed a specialized chemical suppressant that could temporarily halt the growth of the Plaga larvae inside a host. By providing this medication to Leon and Ashley, Luis granted the survivors precious time to maintain their cognitive sanity and fight back against the cult. His scientific intervention was the single most important factor that prevented Leon from succumbing to the parasite's telepathic control. Luis had handed the rescue agent the key to survival. Luis also drafted the blueprints for a radiant wave device capable of completely destroying the adult parasites without killing the host. He knew that physical extraction was impossible, so he engineered a machine that targeted the organism's specific cellular frequency with concentrated radiation. This research represented the ultimate countermeasure against Saddler's biological control, providing a permanent cure for the infection. Luis paid for his betrayal with his life, and Saddler personally executed him in the castle galleries. Before dying in Leon's arms, the scientist handed over his remaining suppressants and research notes, ensuring his work would survive his death. Luis's sacrifice provided Leon with the literal tools needed to dismantle the infection and save Ashley. The former Umbrella researcher had redeemed his past by destroying the cult's master plan from within. Part 36. Ashley rescued, but not free. Though Leon successfully tracked down and pulled Ashley Graham out of the village church's holding cells, the tactical situation remained volatile. Both the rescue agent and the young woman remained actively infected with the developing larval parasites, meaning their bodies were still part of Saddler's biological countdown. The physical rescue offered only a temporary reprieve, as the real threat was growing inside their central nervous systems. Because both survivors carried active Plaga organisms, Saddler maintained a direct telepathic wire into their nervous systems. The prophet could trigger intense physical agony inside their skulls, or briefly override their motor controls from a distance. This biological link allowed Saddler to track their movements across the region and attempt to force them to turn against each other. Ashley was particularly vulnerable to these telepathic pulses due to her lack of tactical training. The infection transformed the simple extraction mission into a complex race against time to find a medical solution. Leon had to manage Ashley's sudden physical collapses and emotional distress while fighting through waves of hostile zealots. Every delay brought the parasites closer to full maturity, threatening to convert both survivors into obedient hosts before they could reach an exit line. The physical space between them and the cult meant nothing, while the infection remained active. Ashley's vulnerability was a constant tactical concern for Leon as they navigated the dangerous environments of the castle and the island. He had to defend her from dedicated capture squads sent by Saddler to retrieve his high-value delivery system. The young woman showed immense courage despite her fear, trusting Leon completely as they searched for Luis's experimental equipment. The bond between them was forged in the shared struggle against the biological takeover. The ongoing infection meant that Saddler's plan remained active even after his surface holding cells were destroyed. The Prophet knew that as long as the parasites survived inside their spinal columns, he retained the ultimate leverage over the American government. The survivors were walking liabilities who carried the seeds of their own destruction wherever they went. Physical freedom was an illusion until the organisms were completely removed from their tissue. Part 37. Méndez dies, and the village chain breaks. The structural collapse of the cult's surface network was finalized when Leon cornered Bitores Méndez inside an isolated slaughterhouse near the mountain gate. The village chief stood as the primary enforcer who had kept the rural population locked in absolute compliance for years. Cornered by the agent's relentless advance, Méndez was forced to activate his dominant Plaga strain, unleashing the terrifying genetic power of his internal mutation. During the violent transformation, the chief's spine elongated and his torso violently separated from his lower limbs, turning him into a centipede-like biological monster. His altered frame hung from the wooden ceiling beams, utilizing long prehensile appendages to smash the structural supports of the burning building. The creature displayed a feral speed and power, his eyes glowing as he attempted to crush the agent beneath heavy timber. Leon utilized localized incendiary traps and precise ballistic fire to target the exposed joints of the chief's mutated spine. He maintained his distance inside the burning room, using his tactical agility to evade the monster's sweeping strikes, while delivering concentrated kinetic trauma to the biological core. The high heat of the fire weakened the parasite's cellular cohesion, accelerating the damage inflicted by Leon's weapons. The destruction of the village chief resulted in a massive explosion that completely incinerated Méndez's cellular matrix, leaving only his false eye behind in the ash. The death of this primary dominant host permanently broke Saddler's telepathic grip over the local valley. Without Méndez's acoustic coordination, the remaining ganados lost their tactical cohesion, their hive-mind link fractured by the loss of their local controller. The fall of the slaughterhouse marked the definitive end of the cult's surface defense network and forced the remaining personnel to abandon the village. Leon recovered the false eye from the remains, using it to unlock the heavy iron gates that led toward the castle grounds. Saddler had lost his most powerful local enforcer, and the path to the inner sanctum was now open to the rescue agent. Part 38. Salazar dies and the castle falls. Following the explosive death of Ramón Salazar inside the central tower, the historic ancestral fortress fell into absolute tactical ruin. The destruction of the Castellan completely cut off Saddler's primary source of domestic funding and stripped the organization of its legal protection within the province. The ancient castle, which had shielded the cult's operations for centuries, was reduced to a burning graveyard of broken biological experiments. The loss of Salazar destroyed the geographical barrier that had protected the deep mining complexes beneath the estate. Without the Castellan's private guard details to manage the automated defense systems, the internal security grid collapsed completely. The remaining high-level Los Iluminados personnel were forced to abandon their mainland clean rooms and retreat to the militarized island complex off the coast. The cult's mainland empire had been completely liquidated. Salazar's death also triggered the disintegration of the zealot formations that garrisoned the stone galleries. The lower hosts lost their central command node, their movements turning erratic as the dominant telepathic frequency vanished from the castle sector. Leon moved through the abandoned halls, the once formidable fortress now silent except for the crackle of fires and the hum of dying generators. The aristocratic shield was gone. The destruction of the castle laboratories meant that Saddler could no longer produce new strains of the parasite or conduct cross-species hybridization experiments on the mainland. The vats, molecular arrays, and research files were left behind or destroyed during Leon's advance, erasing years of scientific progress. The cult leader was stripped of his primary manufacturing center, forcing him to rely entirely on his island facilities. The fall of the castle represented a major strategic victory for Leon and Ashley. as they pursued Saddler to his final stronghold. They had broken the aristocratic power that had enslaved the region for generations, proving that even the most elaborate biological defenses could be overcome. The story was moving away from medieval folklore and castle religion, heading toward a final confrontation in a militarized research zone. Part 39, Krauser fails. Saddler subsequently deployed Jack Krauser to eliminate Leon across a labyrinthine ruin complex situated on the island. The former SOCOM operative was driven by an intense desire to validate his biological enhancements and secure his corporate standing within Wesker's syndicate. Krauser viewed the engagement as a personal duel that had proved his superiority over his former tactical partner. Driven by his arrogance, Krauser unleashed his own dominant Plaga variant during the final phase of the duel, transforming his left arm into a giant, flesh-shielded organic blade. The mutated appendage possessed immense kinetic power, capable of deflecting high-caliber bullets and delivering lethal cleaving strikes across the stone arena. Krauser fought with a feral intensity, boasting that his new biological form had elevated him above ordinary human limitations. Leon maintained his composure against his former comrade's brute force, utilizing precise knife strikes and superior spatial awareness to evade the sweeping blade. He targeted the unarmored sections of Krauser's mutated frame, using his tactical training to exploit the mercenaries' aggressive movement patterns. The duel was a collision between pure biological modification and refined human skill, fought at a breathless pace atop the crumbling ruins. Following a high-intensity engagement, Leon delivered a series of precise strikes that mortally wounded the former soldier, dropping him to his knees in the dust. Krauser's defeat proved that even Saddler's most elite military asset couldn't halt the rescue agent's advance. The mercenary was eventually finished off by Ada Wong, who cleared the remaining threat to ensure Leon could reach the primary research sector. Krauser's death removed the primary military operator, who had enabled the crisis by kidnapping Ashley in Massachusetts. His failure stripped Saddler of his most capable tactical enforcer, leaving the Prophet isolated inside his command bunker. The former soldier, who had traded his honor for biological power, had become another disposable casualty in a war he didn't fully understand. Section 9. The Island and Saddler's Final Form. Part 40. The Island as Saddler's Final Stronghold. Forced off the Spanish mainland by Leon's advance, the remnants of Los Iluminados retreated to a militarized island complex off the coast. The environment shifted dramatically from Gothic folklore and village superstition into a clinical, high-tech industrial testing matrix. This sovereign island served as Saddler's final command bunker, outfitted with automated radar dishes, heavy artillery batteries, and pristine surgical laboratories. The island was an unmapped fortress that operated completely outside international maritime law, allowing the cult to build an industrial bioterror facility without interference. The concrete structures housed massive stasis bays, automated assembly lines, and blast-shielded testing chambers where researchers analyzed the Plaga species under clinical conditions. The location was built to withstand a military assault by sea or air. The layout of the complex reflected Saddler's true ambition, which extended far beyond simple regional religious dominance. The island was engineered to function as a mass production hub for weaponized parasites and cybernetic combat hosts designed for export to global buyers. The Prophet had constructed a modern bioweapons factory beneath the cover of his religious crusade, showing his true face as a corporate terrorist. The island's defense grid was managed from a central command room that monitored the radar systems and automated turret placements across the perimeter. Heavy iron gates and laser detection fields restricted access to the inner sectors, forcing any intruder to fight through narrow industrial killing zones. The island was a formidable barrier that represented the absolute zenith of the cult's technological and military power. Moving the conflict to the island signaled the final phase of the crisis, where the true nature of Los Iluminados was exposed to the world. Leon had to navigate through automated defense systems and heavily armed paramilitary units to reach Saddler's inner core. The island was the Prophet's last stand, a high-tech fortress where the future of global bioterrorism would be decided. Part 41. The cult's military face. On the island, the spiritual zealots of the cult were replaced by the soldiers, a disciplined, heavily armored paramilitary wing of Ganados. These combat hosts were outfitted with body armor, tactical helmets, electronic shock batons, and stationary machine gun turrets. This abrupt shift proved that Saddler's movement had shed its religious mask, standing exposed as a high-tech bio-terrorist syndicate. The soldiers operated with an advanced tactical coordination that far exceeded the primitive tactics of the villagers or castle zealots. They utilized cover mechanics, overlapping firing lanes, and heavy rocket launchers to defend the industrial sectors from Leon's advance. Their central nervous systems were fully integrated with the parasite, allowing them to execute complex military directives without experiencing fear or fatigue. The presence of these armored hosts demonstrated that Saddler had successfully built a private army capable of challenging modern military forces. The workers inside the island laboratories managed the maintenance of heavy weaponry and automated turrets, their daily routines providing a steady flow of military hardware to the front lines. The cult had transformed into an industrialized war machine. The soldiers guarded the high-security clean rooms, where the most dangerous Plaga experiments were conducted, their orders demanding the absolute elimination of any unauthorized personnel. They didn't recite religious chants or wear ceremonial robes, operating in complete silence as they executed their defensive assignments. The religious framework had been replaced by cold military efficiency. This paramilitary face represented the final evolution of Saddler's organizational design, combining the absolute obedience of the parasite with modern warfare technology. The soldiers were a chilling preview of the bioweapons Saddler intended to deploy across global battlefields. Leon was forced to adapt his tactics to fight an armored force that possessed both human tactical intelligence and parasitic resilience. Part 42. Regenerators and Island Experiments. The zenith of Saddler's subterranean scientific horror was realized inside the island's isolation freezing labs through the creation of the regenerators. Engineered by implanting multiple, highly concentrated Plaga parasites inside a single human host, these grey, teeth-gnashing monsters possessed near-infinite cellular regeneration. They represented the most disturbing scientific project executed by Los Iluminados' research team. The physical structure of a regenerador was completely distorted by the presence of the internal parasites, its grey skin rubbery, and its mouth filled with needle-like teeth. When damaged by conventional ballistic fire, the creature's cells hyper-accelerated their replication, effortlessly regrowing severed limbs, torsos, and internal organs within a few seconds. Standard firearms were virtually useless against their regenerative capacity, making them nearly immortal in close quarters. The key to terminating these monsters lay in the destruction of the individual Plaga organisms nesting deep within their muscle tissues. Leon had to acquire a thermal imaging scope to detect the heat signatures of the hidden parasites inside the creature's body. By delivering precise rifle shots directly to these parasitic cores, he could disrupt the cellular regeneration loop and cause the creature to violently explode. A more aggressive variant, known as the Iron Maiden, possessed long organic spikes that could extend from its skin to impale targets at close range. These creatures roamed the cold corridors of the medical bay, their heavy breathing echoing through the quiet halls as they stalked their prey. They were kept in specialized cryogenic stasis pods to prevent their active cells from mutating out of control. The regenerators proved that Saddler's researchers were pushing the boundaries of parasitic biology to create unkillable combat assets. These experiments illustrated the complete loss of human empathy inside the island clean rooms, where human bodies were treated as simple biological canvases for extreme genetic modification. The monsters stood as terrifying monuments to the cult's scientific madness. Part 43. Leon and Ashley removed the parasites. The biological backbone of Saddler's master infiltration plan was permanently broken inside the island's deepest medical facility. Utilizing a radiant wave machine engineered based on Luis Serra's final research files, Leon and Ashley located the equipment needed to save their lives. The device was their final opportunity to escape the telepathic control of the dominant strain before the organisms reached full maturity. Ashley was the first to enter the operating chamber, stepping onto the metal platform while Leon calibrated the machine's controls according to Luis's notes. The device emitted targeted radiation frequencies designed to resonate with the specific cellular structure of the adult Plaga. The intense energy waves targeted the parasite wrapped around her spinal column, forcing the organism to release its neural grip and incinerating its tissue in real time. The procedure caused immense physical agony as the parasite fought against the radiation, its dying tendrils thrashing against Ashley's internal organs before dissolving completely. She collapsed onto the floor, her breathing ragged, but her mind finally free from Saddler's telepathic frequency. The biological Trojan horse that was meant to subvert the American government had been permanently neutralized. Leon then took his turn on the operating table, placing his life in Ashley's hands as she activated the radiant wave sequence. The high-intensity waves targeted the mature organism nesting near his brainstem, tearing through the parasite's cellular walls with concentrated energy. The painful process severed the telepathic wire that Saddler had used to track his movements, completely purging the pathogen from his body. The successful removal of the parasites freed both survivors from the hive mind network, ending their status as walking liabilities. They had achieved what Saddler believed was impossible, using science to defeat the biological takeover. The rescue agent and the president's daughter were finally clean, their minds restored to full autonomy as they prepared for the final confrontation with the Prophet. Part 44. Saddler loses the hosts he needed most. The destruction of the adult parasites inside Leon and Ashley's bodies permanently shattered the central operational mechanism of Saddler's global infiltration plan. By utilizing Luis Serra's radiant wave technology, the survivors deleted the high-frequency neural links that the Prophet relied on for top-down behavioral manipulation. This total failure left the High Prophet stripped of his high-value American political leverage. Saddler realized that his dream of quietly subverting the United States government from within had been completely destroyed in a single moment. Without Ashley as an infected delivery system, he had no way to reach the president or the Joint Chiefs of Staff without triggering an immediate military response. His biological Trojan horse had been converted back into an uninfected civilian who could testify against his organization. The loss of Leon as a secondary host also removed a valuable asset that Saddler had hoped to use to eliminate external threats. The rescue agent was no longer subject to telepathic pain pulses or sudden motor control overrides, allowing him to fight with full physical capability. Saddler was left with no direct influence over his primary targets, his telepathic staff rendered useless against their purged nervous systems. This collapse forced Saddler into a desperate defensive position, as his grand global strategy disintegrated into a localized firefight for survival. The Prophet had spent years building a complex biological network, only to watch it collapse because a single researcher had documented a countermeasure. The high-tech island complex was no longer a staging ground for world conquest, operating merely as a trapped bunker. Saddler's reaction to this loss was one of pure rage and panic, as he realized that his entire enterprise was about to be liquidated. He had lost his village enforcers, his aristocratic ally, his mercenary soldier, and now his primary hostages. The High Prophet was forced to abandon his calculated spiritual persona and confront Leon directly, using the raw biological power of his own dominant strain. Part 45. Saddler's mutation. When cornered by Leon atop the island's central industrial loading rig, Saddler completely cast aside his religious facade. Realizing that his political leverage was gone and his defensive lines were broken, he manually activated the full genetic power of his master, dominant Plaga. His human body violently fractured as the parasite Hyper accelerated its growth, tearing through his ceremonial robes to expose a biological monster. The transformation turned the prophet into a colossal behemoth that towered over the industrial platform. Jointed limbs sprouted from his torso, their surfaces covered in thick muscular armor and hypersensitive eyeball clusters. A giant central eye erupted from a mass of thrashing tentacles at the center of his frame, its lens tracking Leon's movements with a feral focus. This grotesque form completely unmasked the monster beneath the prophet, turning his calculated spiritual authority into pure, raw biological horror. Saddler no longer spoke of divine salvation or holy enlightenment, uttering guttural roars as his massive limbs smashed through the steel beams of the loading rig. He was a biological engine of destruction that sought to crush his enemy through brute force. The creature utilized its long tentacles and jointed legs to sweep across the platform, forcing Leon to execute high-speed evasion maneuvers to avoid being crushed. The industrial rig shook under the kinetic impact of the behemoth's strikes, fuel drums exploding as the combat damaged the structural framework. Saddler had become the ultimate expression of the parasite's destructive potential. Despite his immense size and power, Saddler's mutated form possessed a critical vulnerability in its exposed central eye and secondary eyeball clusters. Leon utilized his tactical mobility to dodge the sweeping strikes, delivering concentrated ballistic fire directly to the sensitive ocular targets. The prophet's final form was a terrifying spectacle, but it was bound by the physical laws of biology, subject to the kinetic trauma of weapons. Part 46. Saddler's Death. The tyrannical reign of the Los Iluminados monarch ended through the combined tactical efforts of Leon Kennedy and Ada Wong. As Leon maneuvered through Saddler's sweeping tentacle strikes on the burning loading rig, Ada secured a high-caliber rocket launcher outfitted with an experimental red warhead. She positioned herself on an upper gantry, waiting for the precise moment to deliver the decisive weapon to the agent. Recognizing that Leon needed heavy ordnance to penetrate the monster's biological armor, Ada tossed the rocket launcher down to the platform. Leon caught the weapon in a single fluid motion, aligning the optical sight directly with the pulsing central eye of Saddler's mutated frame. The prophet roared as he attempted to sweep his massive limbs across the deck, but he was too slow to stop the firing sequence. Leon pulled the trigger, launching the experimental red rocket directly into the core of Saddler's exposed central eye. The high explosive warhead detonated on impact, releasing a thermal blast that tore through the parasite's cellular matrix and shattered its internal organs. The kinetic force of the explosion severed the master neural pathways, causing the behemoth to collapse into a mass of dying tissue. Saddler's massive form shuddered violently as the internal explosions incinerated his cells from within, his yellow eye bursting before his entire body collapsed onto the steel deck. The High Prophet was dead, his mind erased, and his biological empire reduced to a smoking pile of organic debris. The master controller who had sought to enslave the world had been permanently liquidated. The death of Saddler instantly severed the master telepathic frequency, leaving any remaining subordinate hosts across the region completely aimless. The direct threat to the president's daughter and the global community was officially ended, though the industrial platform was already preparing to self-destruct. Leon stood over the remains of his enemy, his mission completed as he prepared to clear the coordinates with Ashley. Section 10. Saddler's Legacy. Part 47. Ada leaves with the sample, while Osmund Saddler was successfully turned to ash. His decades of advanced parasitic engineering weren't destroyed alongside him. Moving with precise corporate focus, Ada Wong forcefully extracted the master dominant Plaga amber sample from the battlefield before triggering the island's industrial self-destruct sequence. She held Leon at gunpoint to secure the keys to the escape jet ski, ensuring her mission achieved its primary objective. This high-stakes extraction ensured that Las Plagas survived as a prized piece of stolen research, rather than burning inside the facility ruins. Ada boarded her escape helicopter, leaving Leon with an ignition key and a timer. Her true employer's agenda fulfilled despite the destruction of the cult. The master sample was secured inside a specialized cryogenic container, ready for transport across international borders. Instead of delivering the primary dominant Plaga directly to Albert Wesker, Ada outmaneuvered her handler by redirecting the master amber to her true employers. She provided Wesker with a subordinate sample harvested from Krauser's corpse, ensuring that the former captain didn't gain absolute control over the master control frequency. This calculated betrayal altered the balance of power in the international bioweapon market. The recovery of the parasite sample ensured that Saddler's scientific breakthroughs would feed the next generation of global bioterrorism. The research files and genetic code were subsequently distributed to rival syndicates and pharmaceutical firms, jump-starting new weaponization programs across Africa and Eastern Europe. The fire on the island had cleared the cult, but the biological asset was already moving. Oda's departure with the sample confirmed that the conflict in Spain was simply one chapter in a larger, expanding war over biological control. Leon watched the helicopter disappear into the morning sky, knowing that their victory was incomplete as long as the parasite survived in external hands. The Master Amber had escaped the ruins, carrying the legacy of Los Iluminados into the future. Part 48. The Legacy of Osmund Saddler. Osmund Saddler stands as a transformative figure who permanently altered the landscape of global bioterrorism. Though he ultimately failed to execute his spiritual conquest of the United States government, his scientific modernization of an ancient, buried parasite successfully broke the global monopoly previously held by traditional viruses. Saddler proved that controlling a host's living mind was infinitely more lucrative and effective than simply rotting their flesh. His integration of ideological indoctrination with advanced virology established a new structural blueprint for future bioterrorist organizations. By wrapping biological control inside the armor of religious faith, he created an army of obedient hosts that required no complex cybernetic programming or expensive maintenance. This synthesis of belief and biology was copied by rival syndicates who sought to build their own compliant workforce. Saddler's dark legacy provided the exact genetic foundation for the Type 2 and Type 3 Plagas deployed across Africa and Eastern Europe in later years. The research files stolen from his island laboratories allowed companies like Tricell to refine the parasite's incubation speed and transmission mechanics, creating even more aggressive variants for the international arms market. The seed planted in the Spanish Valley grew into a global threat. The High Prophet also demonstrated the extreme vulnerability of modern political and security infrastructure to targeted biological subversion. His plan to use a president's daughter as an infected Trojan horse forced intelligence agencies to fundamentally redesign their VIP protection protocols and biohazard defense strategies. The crisis in Spain was a wake-up call for a world that had assumed bioterrorism was limited to aerosol sprays and leaking vials. Ultimately, Saddler failed as a self-proclaimed prophet because his vanity and arrogance blinded him to the resilience of the human spirit. He was defeated by a rookie cop who refused to yield to fear and a researcher who chose redemption over loyalty to a cult. The ruins of his island fortress sank into the sea, a silent monument to a man who tried to build an empire on a parasite, leaving behind a legacy of fire that the world would spend decades trying to extinguish.